Hello, this is going to be a tutorial in how to create a written order prep form. The purpose of the written order prep form is to enable the practitioner who's going to write the written order to understand what the future needs are of the child. So you got to be careful that when you write a written order prep form, you're preparing the author of the written report to make a prescription that will be adequate for the future, for the next year ideally, of the child you're working with. If it's an initial intake form, that's one scenario, but the more common scenario is that you're doing it to produce a reauthorization. So as you move through time, the authorization is going to stop no matter what right there. That's the end date of the authorization. We have to have a reauthorization packet into the insurance company no less than 2 weeks before that end date. So what it comes down to is, if you have a notice from our staff, our administration, saying that a written order needs to be done, there's an urgency to that, because if the written order doesn't exist, you can't provide services after that date. If an authorization expires, you can't provide services after that date either. So those two things have to be done on time. And what we want to do is have them submitted to the editorial process a month before the expiration date. You'll receive notices about that, and please respond to them not as if they are simply suggestions, but that in fact they are directions that you have to follow in order to keep all the wheels turning like they're supposed to in the service delivery process. So here you have what the written order blank looks like if I'm the writer of the written order. And as we move into a realm where other people who have less experience and whatever than I have are going to write written orders, licensed professional counselors can now do written orders for IBHS, for example. I'm a licensed psychologist, so I've got a different training background and experience base than most professional counselors have. So when you empower people who don't have the level of experience and years on the job that I have, it's vital that they get coherent, useful, accurate information about the future needs of the child in the next year based on what's happened in the past year. So here you have the finished, or rather the template for a written order. And this is part B, meaning it's a written order to continue providing services. And you can see up here you've got the usual stuff, last name, first name, and please understand when you put the name in, you want to put last name, comma, first name, because when a child has an unusual or atypical or unfamiliar first name, and sometimes their first name looks suspiciously like a last name, the only way to sort that out, especially for somebody who's never met the child before, is to put last name first, comma, first name, and that clears up all the doubts. Gender is obviously male or female for the purposes of this filing. There may be other developments in the future, but right now the state is recognizing either of those two options. Date of birth is presented in MMDDYYYY format. The county, we have to identify the county, not just the insurance company that they work with, because different insurance companies work with different counties, and we have to make sure that everything matches. So by all means, include the county. The MAID number speaks for itself. It's a 10-digit code. The way I'd like you to do it is do 3 digits, and then 3 digits, and then 4 digits. And that way you'll never send in a code that has 9 or 11, because either of those things tend to make the system crash. The date of the service, again, is in MMDDYYYY format. We need the name of the parent. It has to be spelled correctly. We need their phone number. You have to check that for accuracy. You'll need the name of the school, especially if we're providing services in the school, and we need the parent's email address. So let's look real quick at what the written order prep form looks like. This is the form you'll fill out. If it's an intake, Stephanie Ennis will do that and load the demographic information at the top, and she understands very well how to do that. The important things that you have to do, in addition to checking this for accuracy, is make sure that you check the current written order expiration date, because again, we can't do anything if it expires. And then also the current authorization, we need to check that expiration date. And then you're going to add recent changes in behavior that have taken place in the last 4 weeks. This is a 1 or 2 sentence abbreviated summary of plans that you think will be necessary to implement in the coming 12 months. You'll check whether it's ABA or individual services. You'll identify where the services are delivered: home, school, camp, daycare, and then you'll identify who's going to be providing them over here. We have 3 flavors of BC service: BC unlicensed, BC licensed, and BCBA. You need to identify the correct person over here who is fulfilling these roles. The next authorization start date for all of these usually is the very day after the authorization expires. The authorization end date is normally 6 months later. Some insurance companies want us to write a 1-year authorization, so be clear about where that is supposed to end. You can't write a request in Magellan land, for example, for anything more than 6 months. You can make it shorter. It's not a good idea to do that because people get crazy when they see something that is atypical. So Magellan, 6 months. CCBHO, 1 year. And the peculiar part about that is the written order for both companies is 1 year long. So the written order goes for 12 months without question. The authorization in Magellan land is 6 months, and then you need another one in the same year. CBHO allows us to write an authorization for a full year. So you just have to understand what those standards are for the company that you are submitting your work to for compensation. HPM refers to hours per month, and weekly hours, there's a standard calculation. We have calculators all over the place that you can do that math with a high degree of certainty. So if you're doing 25 hours of BHT service, 25 hours a week translates to about 130 hours per month. We can talk about the calculations and how that's arrived, but rest assured there is a calculator. You have access to it, and you can operate it at will. If you have any questions about how it works or where to find it, you can contact Stephanie, you can contact me, or any number of administrative people or colleagues will probably be able to tell you exactly where that calculator is. Over here in the medication realm, I need the name of the medicine and methylphenidate. If you don't know how to spell it, and a lot of people don't, Google it and put the correct spelling for the medicine in that space. Over here is the current dosage, and under this, in that column, you're going to write the total milligrams per day. Sometimes kids get it TID, that's 3 times a day. BID is twice a day. HS is hour of sleep. We don't need those particular timing references. I just need the total milligrams delivered per per day. And then, of course, we need the name of the current practitioner. This is not a backward-looking document. This is a forward-looking document. So you don't need to write down what the kid used to take that he's not taking anymore. Only write what he's getting right now, and make sure that the dosages and the prescriber are identified correctly, because the insurance companies check. And if you report something that used to be true but isn't now, they get annoyed. Then we get into this section. We're talking about the target behavior, and in here you're going to have one of 5 categories. The very first one should be physical aggression. If that is part of the kid's behavioral repertoire, put that in the number 1 slot. And remember, physical aggression is hostile activity intended to hurt a person. If a kid throws a chair and it bounces off the wall, that's not physical aggression. That's property destruction. It's lack of impulse control. There's a million things you can attribute it to. But it doesn't become physical aggression until it's directed at a person. Screaming in somebody's ear is physical aggression because it hurts. Screaming in a room because you're out of your comfort zone and perhaps beating yourself in the head, that's not physical aggression. If you're beating yourself, that's self-injurious behavior, and it's a safety issue, which is the second most important thing to address. One of the worst things that any child can do is engage in pica, which is the swallowing of inedible objects. God forbid lithium batteries, because they can be deadly. So we have to be careful that we are never ever treating children that we have no business treating. And the bottom line is, we cannot render treatment services to children who cannot be maintained safely in their home or school. If they can't be maintained safely for any reason, they are no longer eligible for IBHS and need to be referred to a higher level of care, perhaps family-based services, which is the last step before institutional placement or residential placement or some other out-of-home placement. Family-based is intended to reduce or eliminate the probability that the kid's going to go and live, sleep outside of the home. Our services are 24/7, 365, Monday through Friday, etc., as long as the child can be maintained safely in the home and community. So what's the third issue? The third one is non-compliance with caregiver prompts. If a child's not listening to the people who are responsible for their health and safety, it's not going to end well. So we have to, as a priority, focus on that as the third of 3 top behavior domains or categories to address. The other 2 are communication. If a child has immature communication, it should be on this list, assuming that one of the top 3 is not on the list. If you have room to put a third one in, put in communication. And if you don't have physical aggression or safety awareness, and the only thing you're dealing with are socialization or communication issues, you can have multiple socialization targets or categories, and then you just define them differently. Where it says target behavior objectives, in this column you're going to identify the specifics about the target behavior that you're addressing. These categories should never overlap. You don't want to track something up here that you're also tracking down here. Over here is the discharge criteria. It is set at 2 for everybody, because 2 is the rating that a parent will give if their child's behavior is normal for a kid that age or tolerable. And some parents can tolerate a lot more than other parents, and the bottom line is, we're not there to be super parents. We're not there to take over the role of the parent. We're there to supplement, train, teach, help the parent be more effective as a growth-producing influence on the child. And then in the average of the past 2 weeks, we want the average of the frequency and severity of target behavior that the child has displayed in the last 4 weeks. And notice, if it's 2, that's the discharge criteria. You can't report a 2 here and keep that in play because they've already met the discharge criteria, and you need to change the goal, the category, and the target behavior, or adjust them in some way so that the number you're putting in here is over 2. And then you're going to cut and paste from the most recent assessment. You're going to identify the name of the person who did it and the date on which it was completed. And you'll copy and paste the target and replacement behavior grid and the needs and concerns section from the last assessment report, but then you need to update it to project future needs. Because don't forget, the written order is forward-looking. It doesn't care about what happened in the past. You can add things about what happened in the past when you talk about medical issues that may exist in the child's life. If they have a seizure disorder or some other physiologic condition that is going to influence their behavior, Tourette syndrome, etc. And don't forget that a diagnosis does not determine what behavior can occur. A child with autism can be physically aggressive, or a child with ADHD can be physically aggressive, or a child with brown hair can be physically aggressive. It doesn't make any difference what their diagnosis is. The only time where it might have an impact is in the case of ADHD. If a child has a diagnosis up here of ADHD, and they're getting medicine for ADHD down here, that's a win, because those 2 areas now match. But if a child has a diagnosis up here of autism, and he's getting treated with medicine for ADHD down here, you have a disconnect. And the way you repair that is not to add another, a second, a third, a fourth diagnosis. Add it in medical issues that will be reported to reconcile the fact that the kid's getting hyperactivity treatment medicine, not for ASD, but for his hyperactivity symptoms that are identified outside of the diagnostic window. Remember that diagnosis is much, much more important for classification and funding. Diagnosis may at some point in the dark and distant past have something to do with the treatment program. We don't treat diagnoses, we treat symptoms. So the autism spectrum is an enormous collection of potential symptoms. Some kids are falling here on the continuum or here or whatever, but they have unique symptoms that we should be addressing, not diagnoses. Diagnoses are for classification and funding. Symptoms are for treatment. I hope that's helpful in terms of explaining what the written order preparation form is supposed to do. And the only thing I want to point out to you, let's go back to that form. When you identify the category of behavior, they can't overlap. They have to be different. So down here again, you see the same behavior category. And the identified target behavior is going to be copied from this section of the form. If you identify it in here, I'm going to transfer, I'll copy and paste it into this form, and I'll put it in right here, so that we again have a coherent presentation of target behavior that is forward-looking into the coming year. This is what we're going to address, and this has been the average in the past 4 weeks. Here is where the needs and concerns section is pasted and then updated to capture current and future needs. And you see, it doesn't need to be an extensive 8-10 paragraphs long. You can selectively pull from the needs and concerns section and make it fit in this approximate space. Now, I can stretch it to fit if I have to, but what I'm trying to do is create a document that is easily digestible by the insurance company, because if we make them work too hard, they push back. And the way they push back is say, no, we need a conversation with the prescriber and you, and we have to argue about why you're asking for the, it just gets deeper and deeper if you don't do it conveniently for them. And the whole purpose of this written order prep form is to take information from the assessment, process it through you as the lead clinician, and render what we think is a reasonable projection for the next 12 months for the child. And then we fill out this grid. If it's ABA in the Magellan world, we click that box. If it's individual service, we click that box. Individual services are the only one that can do mobile therapy. You see no mobile therapy down here in the ABA realm. So some kids will need individual for the mobile therapy part and ABA services for the other services. This is a BCBA. This is a licensed BC because you're not allowed to do ABA treatment unless you are licensed. So again, there's a correction here that you have to spot. If you're not licensed and you're assigned to a case where a child has autism, that's incompatible. That's a round peg in a square hole. It's an error. And we've got to catch those kinds of errors before we make the mistake of going down a path that we're not allowed to travel on. Here is the BHT service, but again, this is ABA treatment as opposed to BHT services up here, which is not ABA. The standards for supervision in ABA treatment are different from the standards for supervision in individual cases. So we always have to know what we're doing and why. Because a child doesn't need ABA necessarily if they are autistic. We may not be treating them for autism symptoms. We may be treating them for physical aggression. That's not an autism symptom. It's a behavior problem. If we're not treating the child for autism symptoms, then we may not need to have an autism-based or ABA-based treatment program. It's a gray area. But for the most part, if the kid's autistic, we want a licensed BC working with them and supervising the BHTs who are rendering treatment to that child. And we want to meet the standards for an ABA program in all cases where a child has an autism spectrum disorder. And then lower down on this sheet, you'll see that we're going to identify the parent, who we talk to. They're going to be asked to sign off on this. I'll sign off on it here as the prescriber. And if somebody replaces me as an LPC, their promise ID number will appear here, their NPI number will appear here, and their license number and the type of license they have will appear here. And that is a written order tour de force. The written orders created for CCBHO in Delaware County are based not on Microsoft Word documents, they're based on PDFs that you have to fill out. But it's the same basic process. You still have to include that information from the needs and concerns and the most recent assessment, copy, paste, but don't forget to update it to capture the current and future needs that the child is likely to have in the coming 12 months. There you have it. That's a written order, and I hope it was helpful to get this tutorial. Bye now.